Good day, everyone. Welcome to the Daily Ward. And the word of the day is bank, as in central bank, as in the Trump administration and the Federal Reserve Bank. The Trump doesn't like Fed Pal right now, and it's kind of funny to watch this dramatic show play out in the political spectrum. The news media likes to make a big thing of it, but Trump does have certain language that he likes to use, and it's fun to watch his Twitter account. So if you're not watching him and his Twitter, I highly recommend that you do, and then watch the market's reaction when he says something kind of outlandish. It's hard to be a day trader, I guess, if you don't have that Trump feed. But anyway, that's besides the point. Today's show is interesting. I'm going to try not to dig down into the weeds of this whole situation when we got ourselves into as far as the interest rates on the economy. What's it mean to you? You should probably know how the system works. There's a global financial system and an economic and geopolitical system that either work in your favor or they don't. You can play the cards right in your life and end up, very wealthy if you live in the United States, or you can play the wrong cards at the wrong time and end up broke by the end of your life. So you could do it either which way. I think the humans have an uncanny ability to adapt to situations and to adapt to market conditions and where they want to be. Now, I'm a millennial, and I'm not for socialism or democratic socialism, as millennials like to say and argue. Don't necessarily believe in the full rhetoric that comes out of politicians' mouths, the news media. Look, most politicians haven't done much of anything but have been a politician in their life. They've gone to school and they ran for office, or they had a job here or two, raised some money, ran for office, got the gig, and I've spent quite a long time filling an office or a seat in the House, the Senate, a local jurisdiction, your local governments, and they're not financially and economically inept to handle certain situations, and of course politicians decide on a budgetary measure for the federal government. Look, the federal government is too big. It's been too big for quite a long time. I wrote a bunch of notes on what I'm going to be speaking about specifically today, which is not necessarily the back and forth between, or I guess just the one-way argument that Trump is having about the Fed, how the Fed is stifling growth by keeping interest rates high when the rest of the world has low or negative rates. Now, having low and negative rates is a backfire of a situation, or it's not a good situation. We don't want to have zero, even though it introduces ease to lending practices at banks, because we live in a fractional banking society and a system. And regardless of whether you realize it or not, you are a part of a system. We live in this system. We buy into it. We work into it. We, can provide value and gain monetarily from it. But you are born into a medical system. You are pushed into an education system. You are forced into an economic system. And you can either use it to your advantage, or you can, not, like I said earlier, play your cards right and end up rather broke. Now, the system works if you work it. There's a lot of flaws, though, in how we do business globally, and I'm going to speak real quick today about how we've gotten kind of into this situation. And I do think the President Trump is wrong when he wants economic growth for the country. This is not a bad thing. Economic growth is amazing. Free market capitalism is amazing. Now, do we live in a free market capitalistic society? The answer is no. We have like a quasi democratically, or I guess it would be like a quasi, it's somewhere in the middle of free market capitalism and socialism. because the government is so big. It's literally the biggest business in the world, and it's up for grabs every 4 to 8 years. I always say that. It's like having, Apple or Google turn over their whole executive suite every 4 years. So it's quite interesting to see the political situation always play out. Now, we've gotten to far ends of the spectrum in the United States as far as very dualistic running of the government. Anytime, like for right now, the Democrats have control of the House, they do nothing. They have control of Congress, and they don't do very much with their control. They want to stifle any type of progress that happens in the executive branch. That's what's happening right now. Without kind of putting politics aside and going back to what I was saying, how we're kind of born into this system, and I like looking at these type of graphics because it really, if you didn't realize this is how it really rolls downhill, this is where we're at in society. And I'm going to explain kind of the banking and regulation side of things. So if you can't see that, I'll try to make it bigger here. I like looking at these graphics because I'm not very much of a conspiracy theorist, but this gives you some sort of idea of how control works in the financial sector. So, regardless of the top 5 rungs of this pyramid here, if you look at just where normal population of people are, then you have population control with religion, governments, universities, police, school, courts. Above that, you have they call it resource control, which is the corporations in the world. And above that, you have the financial control to the system. So above that, who really knows? Oh, I guess think tanks is a part of it. Trilateral Commission, the United Nations, Bilderberg Group, Club of Rome. Do your own research. You can dig into that stuff if you really want. I'm not here to have a conspiracy theorist show. I'm here to kind of explain we're not necessarily in the greatest of spots, and having the media control the narrative about pushing a financial agenda onto the markets as far as talking about a recession when a recession isn't necessarily in order. So with all that being said, I'm going to get into my notes a little bit here. So as far as that pyramid system works, it's really a corporatocracy, the way that the system is kind of worked. You have corporations that lobby to the government and really control the government through backdoor monetary deals and stuff. And then above the, corporations, you have the banks, which lend to corporations that want to, introduce growth into their, system of, managing something and making something, producing something for people to buy, right? And that further controls. It's like a cycle. Now, you can operate in that system. You can make a lot of money yourself by extracting the value of the corporations in the stock market. So it's not necessarily an evil system. It just doesn't necessarily work for everybody. So, and that's what you see now with kind of the division of people who may have limited knowledge of what this whole system and how it really works, and they're very poor, and they have a victim mentality, and they have a backlash, and that's why you have all these, they're controlled by the media. The media controls their thought. The university system controls their thought, that type of thing. But to really dive deep into this, the Trump administration is not necessarily impressed about what the Federal Reserve does. I don't think they necessarily like how this system actually works. And I can see why, and I'm going to explain here. So above the central banks of the world, those are your banks in countries that, are part of the government system. In the United States, it's its own entity. And above that is the Bank of International Settlements, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank. Now, each one does its own thing. The Bank of International Settlements helps the big banks in the world, your Bank of America, your Goldman Sachs, your Citibank, your even smaller international banks like MUFG, and just banks in general. I don't need to name them all, but the big six banks in the world. So they help settle payments between countries and banks, and the banks are intermediaries, and the Bank for International Settlements actually helps control this flow of international exchange. The IMF makes loans to countries that are experiencing economic distress. The monetary funds are conditional on financial stability. They have structural adjustment programs, conditional loans for countries, and they're supposed to alleviate poverty around the world, but there's a lot of criticism and questioning of what the IMF actually does and its practices, and then what the countries do when they receive the loan and don't pay it back. I mean, we've seen this happen in Argentina. It's kind of a colonialistic form of the way that money moves around the world. So it kind of further exasperates poverty. That's an argument for another day. The World Bank is offers again loans to low income countries, right? Poverty stricken areas of the world, and it was developed in founded in 1944, and we still have a lot of poverty around the world. The World Bank and the IMF. It's just it kind of makes you think a little bit of what their actual intents and purposes are. But back to the Bureau of International Settlements. Now, in 1998, they imposed Basel I. It's an accord. It's an economic reform for banks around the world. And they imposed the 8% capital reserve requirement on central banks to hold. So the central banks of the countries that you live in, the United States has a Federal Reserve, are required to hold 8% of their net assets on the books at any given time for, to make adjustments in the economy if all hell breaks loose. There's a Great Depression or another great financial crisis. But these Basel Accords have kind of really spun out of control. Japan, because of the Basel I Accords, went into a lost decade. Their banking system only had 3 to 5% reserve requirements, and when they bumped it up to 8, the credit got sequestered out of their banking system really fast, and they've been in a lost decade since like 1999. They've had zero or negative rates. They've gone in with quantitative easing measures, and it's just they're floating as far as people aren't necessarily buying into their banking system there and propping up their economy. The banking system is now it's a safe haven currency, and that's a topic for another day. Let me get through this a little bit because I don't want to get too long-winded. The Basel II Accord imposed mark-to-market capital valuation standards requiring international banks to revalue reserves according to market conditions. Now, the U.S. did this in November 2007, and by December 2007, liquidity out of the market basically made the stock market collapse and dried up banks. So they withheld loans because now they were having to meet this, another reserve requirement based on the conditions of the banks, and it was kind of a shock. It was what do they call it? I don't know how to say the word. Exogenous shock to the market. Anyway, so the banks were sequestered in their lending practices, and most banks make a lot of money within the fractional reserve system on mortgages and mortgage loans. And without having a full understanding of how the collateral mortgage obligations and structured debt works, and then having the shock imposed by having regulation on the banking system, you see what happened in 2008, 2009. The financial world unraveled, mainly on the backs of having unstructured debt go bad, and people, there's also technology that was involved, and that's a topic for another day as well. The point I'm getting to is this. Excessive government regulation, whether it's fiscal or monetarily, is not good for, business, especially smaller, medium-sized businesses. It puts a stranglehold on businesses because there's further regulation. Your household is a business. You want to upgrade your house. You want to get into that next living standard. Now, appreciation in housing prices is also stifled by these, these capital adjustments that the BIS forces banks to do, central banks to do, which in turn forces the next level of the big six banks to do, which enforces the next level, which is corporations and households, because your household is kind of like a corporation, and their borrowing practices. And then this is just another way that monetary or the money supply gets sequestered out of the system and then enters into a deflationary period. So now pushed too far the other way with anti-regulation really only benefits the largest of corporations and companies, as they're free to use their economic power, their buying power, their purchasing power to warp the free market in their favor. So there has to be a happy medium between banking regulation and no regulation. And the way the system is set up now with its pyramid-like structure, it doesn't necessarily work through times of economic recession and deflationary periods within the banking system. So I think when we're talking about politics, I think the Trump administration kind of understands this. They don't necessarily like how the banking system has influence over an economy, especially the largest economy in the world. The Trump administration wants the U.S. economy to do well, and they're having a hard time doing that because the Federal Reserve has a dual mandate. They want moderate inflation and maximum unemployment. Now, they get that by using different tools that they have at their disposal. One is adjusting the federal funds rate. That's the interest rates. Another is, changing reserve requirements in banks that operate within the United States. There's a couple of other tools. I don't want to get into them because it gets super nerdy, but it doesn't necessarily always work out to our favor, as in the people, the collective humans that live within the system. The corporations might get a free ride as they might get bailed out, but us as regular everyday people, even if you have some bit of wealth, you're definitely hugely affected by these decisions that get made with just a handful of people in the world. So it's kind of scary. And where we're at right now, if we did hit a recessionary period, the Federal Reserve doesn't have enough leeway to introduce, lax lending practices in the bank to make people have more money, basically influence the money supply so that we can go out and buy and purchase and keep the economy rolling at as far as an economic growth, or not necessarily an exponential rate, but a slow tick up in the system. The problem stems from, I guess, Glass-Steagall Act. There was another act in the 90s. I forget the name of it. The Bliley. Doesn't matter. It eludes my mind right now. But basically, what happened is many in the late 90s, branch banking and interstate bankings merged into these huge conglomerates of banks buying out banks, right? And now we have very few banks, and a hit to one of the banks is a problem that gets imposed upon the whole system. That's why Basel III Accord, which is just rolled out, I guess, after the great financial crisis in 2009, it came on board to stress test the banks. They had like 3 years to meet these stress test requirements, and this got imposed. The Federal Reserve went along with the BIS's Basel III. It was supposed to be voluntary. It's kind of mandatory now, but because the Fed imposed it, as far as their guidelines and restrictions on what banks can and cannot do. But it's to make sure that banks aren't overly levered in their debt obligations. It's to make sure that they have liquidity. I guess it's liquidity to leverage, or leverage to liquidity ratio. Make sure that they're not influencing the market with their positions on the market wholeheartedly. and that the data that's being pushed through this financial tech system is safeguarded. So there's a couple of measures. I'm trying not to get really far into the weeds of this. The whole point of me coming on today and talking about this is, this hierarchical structure of banking system that we live in, this global economic financial system, it could be reformed to work better for the average everyday person. Now, a lot of people in the United States have fallen under this, socialism is a good idea thing, and it's not. You don't have the freedom of choice. State controls are in place. Rationing happens. A couple other measures I'll cover here in a second, but we could really do without these highly influenced regulations on the free market. Now, I am a free market capitalist. We don't live in that society, despite what people think. People think that capitalism is, the root of evil because it destroys the earth, and they're wrong because they are a part of the capitalistic system and they can vote with their dollars. This is what free market, it introduces competition. You see this with companies like Beyond Meat. 10, 15 years ago, there wasn't this big vegan push in the world, in the United States, for example. People weren't going from, into a meatless dieting frenzy, really. So people started voting this kind of with their dollars into the market. And now you have this company, and companies like, White Castle having the Impossible Burger, which is their answer to the Beyond Meat company's, home, grilling, right? So you have an influence on the market, and you vote with your dollars. You vote with your dollars. That's what free markets are. It allows people to decide what is right for capitalism or the growth in a society. Now, I should probably cover this in a couple of different shows. I'm trying to get most of it all into one show, and I'll wrap it up with, being a part of, the Federal Reserve System, central banking system, fractional banking system, and then the BIS, the IMF World Bank system. It's not necessarily good. It stifles innovation. You have a few people making decisions that controls the wealth of the world, resulting in, further influence and a tilt in the economic system at the hands of, a few major international banks, and away from economic sectors and stability of free markets. This threatens political liberty of the country that has these regulations imposed on them. Political liberty exists to govern through morality and virtue. We are very fortunate in the United States to be able to have, or some semblance of, I'm not saying we have it completely because we don't, but we have freedoms and we have inalienable rights. And we should not be taking those inalienable rights for granted. People flow into the United States to have these rights. And you have this whole class of people that want to sequester these rights, these property rights. They want bigger government. Bigger government is not the answer to this, this whole equation. And that's what it seems like when you listen to media, narratives, things, the narrative coming out of the university system, people that live in these areas like California, New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Chicago, they're going further and further left in the spectrum because they're being fueled by a rhetoric of hate. And it's just disgusting to see. I'm trying to explain why it exists. These people want control of this economic structure and system. They want control. They want the United Nations to be enacted. They want the U.S. to be a part of the United Nations. They want to abolish the sovereignty of the United States. That's why I'm going on and on about this. I probably should have covered that in the beginning of this monologue, but that's the real reason. that you're seeing this bigger government control, the Green New Deal, which is not good for very much of anyone. It's just, I'm not saying that the economic system is great. It's not. Capitalism has its flaws, but we don't necessarily live in a free market either. So, I do not support government intervention into the free markets. The market will function properly with people voting with their money, their disposable income that they have. Now, this is a big equation. Can't be solved in just having a 20-minute monologue on YouTube. But this is kind of what I stand for. The economic system, it's warped in special interest and private monopolistic practices. I don't support socialism, and I don't support monopoly capitalism either. They both lead to totalitarianism, which is what you have in China. I support a free market system. We need to cut the fiscal deficit and lower taxes at the same time. This is hard. This is a hard thing to do. We need smaller government. We need more money in the people's pockets to vote for their dollar, to cause competition, for people to go into business. The United States has an entrepreneurial spirit. And we really need to rethink the way that we're a part of this whole system that's been set up not necessarily at the benefit of the human population or environment or the environmental factors. So, massive government intervention is not the answer. Monetary policy, fiscal policy, it leads to a lot of things. Prolongs unemployment. It implements price controls and rationing, stifles innovation, controls the use of technology, and suppresses groups of people, that are outside of the government control. So I'm for, reforming this whole monetary system, this whole global financial system to make it benefit and work. And you're seeing that in politics now. You want people with more control. We don't need more control over the banking system, the financial sector. We need less regulation. I'm not saying we need less environmental regulation, although that does stifle innovation and growth in its own accord. That's a whole nother topic, a subject and conversation. Anyway, I've gone on way too long. I get super nerdy about this. This is supposed to be a short monologue, Monday through Thursday. It's the Daily Ward. You're watching the Daily Ward on the Ward Room Live channel. The Ward Room Live is a Sunday morning talk show with me and a co-host, Mr. Mike. And we really dive into these topics. This topic I know a lot about. I've studied this at the university, at the grad student level. I've worked in the banking system. I've been a trader. So, I've worked for the government. I've been a laborer. I have a very well-rounded background to kind of come at this in different perspectives and understand it. So that's why I really get nerdy about economics and finance. I probably won't do a PhD, although people ask me when I get into these topics conversation, they should, you should go do a PhD. And I'm like, no, because it takes too long and I'm too old for that shit. Anyway, but it's just the Daily Ward I don't just cover this topic. We get into a lot of others. So if you like these type of conversations, we talk about science and technology, innovation, environment. We talk about, all the great, hard to, come up with solution to the world's challenges. That's the topics areas that we cover. And it's exciting. I love being a part of it. I love studying this stuff. So if you like the content, please subscribe, hit the notification bell. There's a slew of things in the show description, the show notes that I have on the replay. So click on the links to the other social media sites. We're just getting started. Yes, that's it. Thanks for joining me. This has been the Daily Ward, and I'll see you all tomorrow. Coming on here daily. The Daily Ward is a daily show, so I'll see you all tomorrow. Thank you.